I tell the children that even in those days, back in the 1800s, they had hot and cold running water. You tipped the pitcher and the water ran. Since in those days, if you didn't have fireplaces, you only had one place that was heated, and that was the kitchen. Many mornings, people would get up to wash, and they'd have to break the ice in the pitcher, in the pitcher itself, and that it wasn't very comfortable. If you talk to them about going out to the bathroom, out to the outhouse, and get into the term what outhouse means and so forth, and then they can get a feeling for the time. This takes us up to the birds. The birds are not indigenous to Framingham. And I use this word when I'm speaking to the third graders and ask them what they think that means, because then I point to the next case and say, these birds are indigenous to Framingham. But they're a great example of how the wealthy showed their wealth by having either stuffed animals or stuffed birds. I also talked to them about entertainment in that era, in that time. There was no radio, no television. To entertain each other, when someone came, they would go into the parlor. And of course, when I say the word parlor, we have to tie that in for the children for the living room today. The parlor in those days were usually shut off by pocket doors for the wealthy or by portieres. Heavy felt cloth, or in the summer they would use beads. They would open this up for special occasions, either for holidays or for visiting company. And then Mother would say to Alice, Alice, would you please entertain your aunt and uncle? And Alice might get up and recite a poem. They might play an instrument. They might tap dance. They might sing for them and so forth. But in those days, they entertained each other in their parlor. And of course, this furniture you see here is beautiful furniture, again, made to last. A marble top table, a beautiful couch, and usually stuffed with horsehair. The lovely fireplace, marble, again, cut glass for the candle holders. And those people, of course, with wealth would have their portrait of their relative in this room. You can see one of the small organs over here, and they had a pedal on the bottom, sort of like an accordion, where you would force in the air so that you could play it. Another instrument that they would use for entertainment was the stereopticon. And using this instrument, they could get a pretty good 3D picture of scenes around the country or around the world. And of course, this was very entertaining for people who never left their town. Continuing with our taste of luxury, showing what the wealthy had, we have a beautiful case of china. We show the children on the basement the 1600s, the 1700s, and we show them wooden instruments, wooden tools, wooden plates, noggins, wooden jugs, and so forth. And after they had used everything that they had in the area that they could make by themselves, since they didn't have stores to go to and so forth, they moved from that with a little more wealth to pewter. Today, pewter is very expensive, but in those days it was rather inexpensive. Then when they got more money, they went into china. And of course, this doesn't impress a lot of the people today, because most people have china. But as we look into the case, we can see that they would show certain anniversaries for buildings and so forth. We have a lovely one of our memorial library here that we have at the center with the Civil War soldier in front of it. We have another one depicting one of the buildings at the Framingham State College in 1853. We have material showing the Chautauqua from Mount Waite. And of course, this was a summer program of bringing education into the small villages, and it was done by religious organizations and groups. Next, we're going to look at the old bone shaker, or one of the two-wheel bikes. And here is our bone shaker. It's a beautiful two-wheeler. It's very high. This impresses many of the children that come in, even the adults. This is hard rubber tire. This is the spring, the comfort that they would have to give them some leeway. You notice over in the corner, there's a step, and they would step on that with their left foot as they would to mount a horse. And then they would throw their right leg over, and they had to have great balance. You have to remember, too, that the roads were terrible in those days. A lot of cobblestone, a lot of dirt roads. So you had to be very brave, and you had to have beautiful balance, and also, in order to ride this thing, you had to have an excellent costume. You had to look good on top of this. The handbrake up here, in the middle is an odometer, and it shows how fast they went. If they got up to 10 miles an hour, they were really speeding. People ask, why the height and why the front tire bigger than the other? I don't know. But some of them suggest that because there's still many horses and carriages around, that they wanted to be seen. They had to be as high as the carriages going by so that they wouldn't be run over. In back of this is a fine old street lamp. They had oil lamps and they had gas lamps. Now, this is long before we had electricity. In many of the pictures that we have in the Academy, in the museum here, it shows these lamps on the post lighting up to light up the town at night. This lamp, oil lamp, was used in 1850 to 1880. Now, I thought that that was pretty long ago, but my father-in-law, who lived in Worcester, said he was a lamplighter, which surprised me. And I asked him, did you use a ladder? And he said, no. He had a long stick with a little knob on the end of it, and then the door itself had a hook eye in it. He would open the door with that. He would then get the hook eye for the gas and pull it down. And on the end of that, he had a string and a rope, and he would pull that, and it was just like a cigarette lighter. They had a flint at the top, and he would spark it and light the gas. And then he would just use the door, the stick to shut the door. In the morning, on the way to school, he would reverse that process. Open the door with the hook and eye, pull down the gas, and shut it off. And here I'm thinking, you know, gas lamplighters, that's many years ago. But here's my father-in-law being a lamplighter on the way to high school. People questioned why we would have dolls in the museum. Unless you're a doll collector, I guess that's a pretty good question. But, which is very important to a museum, is showing the people the styles of clothing of that time. And if you compare the dolls in the case and look at the portraits, then you can see that they reflect the dress of that era. You can see that there's a young man in this case dressed just as this fellow is, Frederick Billings is at the top. The portrait of Lucy Billings here with her beautiful lace and her beautiful brooch and beautiful belt and so forth, taffeta, all that, is also reflected in the dolls. We point out to the children that if we took a Barbie doll or a Ken doll and put it in the case today, and 100 years from now, children come in the year 2096, they could see exactly the style and the dress that we wear today. And we think, of course, we're right up to date. These are children's doll carriages, and a very interesting thing is it looks just like the horse-drawn carriage, and that's what they reflected. The portrait in the middle is the portrait of a child. Most of the children don't read the sign, and they think that's a little girl, but that's Frederick Billings. At that time, at that era, when they did portraits with children, they usually included an animal. Young boys would be in dresses up to maybe the age of 3 or 4. Also, the young boys in those days, too, would have long banana curls. Frederick doesn't, but a lot of them seldom cut their hair until they reached maybe the age of 5. Going right along, the dollhouse, again, is part and parcel of this same reflection. This is a dollhouse of the 1890s, or the Victorian era, and of course it reflects that furniture of that time. The Barbie collectors have beautiful dollhouses. They have all kinds of now transportations for Barbie, but everything that we have today reflects our time. The early Barbie dolls of the 50s would reflect the clothes of the 50s. They're great collector's items. So as you can see, from the furniture, whatever room you're in, the kitchen, the dining room, the living room, and notice an indoor bathroom. Very, very important to be very wealthy. Speaking with my aunt who grew up in Everett, Massachusetts, which has Monsanto Chemical, etc., one of her great points of pride was the fact that she said that they had the first indoor plumbing in Everett. Now it's time to move on to the next corner. And speaking of time, a beautiful example of craftsmanship in America is the grandfather clock. You'll notice that it's brass. You'll notice that the size of it, the height of it, very imposing. Again, in the wealthy homes, this was an indication of their wealth. Beautiful sound of the clock when it struck half hour an hour. Many of them could show the days and the months. They show full moon. They gave you all kinds of information. But again, we have to remember this is indicative of the wealthy period in the 1800s. Another interesting thing at that time was how they dealt with death. And this is a family record, and this family record shows births and deaths. They would do the same thing in the Bible. They would keep a very accurate record of who was born, where they were born, and to whom. And when we're looking up our family records today, this is a great source for us in going back and getting information. If you look at this chart here, this one is in memory, this is a hand-painted watercolor in memory of Captain Samuel and Mary Frost in 1830. And of course they have the weeping willow, they have the urn, they have all kinds of symbols of that era to show their sadness. Beginning with the Civil War, then they started, because they were shipping bodies home from all the battlefields, then they get into the idea of displaying the body for longer periods of time. Prior to that, it might be a one-day affair because they would have the old wooden casket, the old wooden box, and they would observe the person, have the prayers, and then bury them immediately. They had to get into embalming in order to ship the bodies home to their families. And then they got into actually taking pictures of the person in the casket. And so many of the books that we have in the museum would show little children, or showing the mother or the father and so forth, actually in the casket, which I think is pretty interesting for that era, that period of time. This building that we're in, as I pointed out to you at the very beginning, was an academy. I mean, they paid to come here. We first had a red brick school building in 1792, and then in 1857 this building was erected. This was very well known throughout the state. People came from everywhere to come to school here and to be educated. The furniture that you see here all came from Framingham. The teacher's desk that you see here over in that corner, the children's desk. This material was found in the basement of the Hastings School up at the junction. It's very beautiful furniture. It's all wrought iron. It was, again, made to last. The lady you see here is a school mom, and she had to know how to read, write, and to cipher. She had to be tested by a school committee, which was usually made up of 3 men. And they were the learned people at that time, doctors, lawyers, and the ministers or the preachers. They would teach in the spring and in the summertime the young children and the girls. In the fall and the winter, they had grammar masters, and the men had to have at least 2 years of university, and again, they would be interviewed by the 3-member school committee. They taught